Would you like to learn how to make this beautiful matrimonial cake, a true Canadian classic dessert? Stay tuned for the next episode of Hilltop Stovetop. Hello and welcome back to Hilltop Stovetop, the show where we're teaching you how to make great meals in an ordinary kitchen. Today we're making a Canadian favorite. According to Wikipedia, this is truly a Canadian dish known in Western Canada as matrimonial cake and in Eastern Canada as date crumbles or date squares. Now, their reason for it being called matrimonial cake, a little bit controversial, so shall we say. There's some that say that matrimonial cake is because there's two separate layers brought together by dates. You know, isn't that cute? You have a date before you get married, and which symbolizes two people courting and solidifying their relationship in marriage. And others feel that the smooth and rough textures of the date squares represent the easy and difficult times of the marriage. So that's why they call it matrimonial cake. Of course, date squares, date crumble, the name is self-evident when you'll see when we put this together, because there's definitely dates and it's definitely kind of crumbly. Now this is one, I have several recipes. I've got a lot of cookbooks that are all fundraiser kind of cookbooks, local groups that have put them together. Today I've chosen to use the version that is in the fundraiser cookbook from the Baffin Regional Health Center. And I've recently sort of reconnected with a few people that I knew when I lived up there. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just a little nod to the Baffin region in Canada. So we're going to start by getting our date mixture ready to go. We start off with a pound of dates, so it's a little bit less than what a full package is. And we're going to add in a half a teaspoon of baking soda and a tablespoon of lemon juice. Now, some versions of this call for cinnamon instead of the lemon juice as a flavoring, but I think lemon juice is the way to go. We're also going to add just about a half a teaspoon of vanilla. And the recipe calls to put in a cup of brown sugar into this. Now, one of the downsides, I'll say, to these squares is that they are incredibly sweet. And personally, I prefer to leave the sugar out of this and just let the dates hold their own. So I'm going to do this without, but if you like things that are super sweet, go ahead and add a cup of brown sugar to this. So now we're going to add in a cup and a half of hot water. I did boil the kettle, so I'm going to add in a cup and a half of that and just put that on the stove, and that'll simmer away while we get ready to start making the outer part of this. Okay, so the dates are cooking. Now for the filling, we've got a cup and a half of flour, and we're going to add a cup and a half of rolled oats, and a quarter teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking powder, and half a teaspoon of baking soda. And here I am going to add in the sugar, so we've got a cup of brown sugar. Mix together those dry ingredients. Now the recipe that I'm using calls for melted butter. Some recipes you just use solid butter and rub it together just the same as we did with our recipes for baking powder biscuits and for pie crust. But I think it's a little easier to put in the melted butter. So we've got all those mixed together. My brown sugar was a little bit on the lumpy side, so I'm giving it an extra bit of a stir here. Okay, then we've got a cup of melted butter, so we're just going to add that in. And mix this all up. So you want to make sure that you mix it enough that everything is moistened, like you don't have any dry bits, because those will just flake off. Okay. So now I've got a square pan. I just happen to have a disposable one. Now the reason I'm choosing to make this today is a friend of mine, his birthday is on the weekend, and his wife tells me that this is one of his favorites. So by putting this in a disposable pan, that means that I can deliver it and not worry about getting the pan back. So we've got our crumb mixture here, and we're going to take half of it. If anything, just a little bit more than half to go on the base. And we're going to spread that around. And then we want to press it down into the bottom. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to just take a little bit of plastic wrap and wrap your hand up in this. Now, of course, you could do this with just a bare hand, but it's sticky and it's gooky, and I find if we just do that. Another way to do it is to just spread the plastic wrap over the top of this, and then if you've got a second pan like this, put that on top and squish down onto it. All right. Okay, so there's our base done. We just have to let these dates cook just a little bit more, because these are dried dates, and if we just leave them as they are, I mean, it's going to take a little bit for that water to absorb up into there. So we're going to let that continue to cook for a few minutes, and then when they're soft, then we'll come back and we'll continue with our construction process here. Okay, so that didn't take very long, maybe 5 minutes or so, but it really thickened up. The sugars came out of the dates and made more of a syrupy kind of a texture. And then what we're going to do here, you could just put it on like this or mash it up just a little bit by hand. I am going to use the little, my stick blender and puree it a little bit more. It's not going to be perfectly smooth, but that's okay. By pureeing it, that'll make it easier to cut when we're done. And then we're going to take this and just spread it over our base. Now this particular version is making quite a thick center layer. Some versions do this same thing in a 8.5 or a 9 by 11 pan, so the thicker or the longer pan, so you'd end up with a thinner layer of dates. And it just depends on your own tastes. Okay. And then we're going to take the second half, the topping, and just sprinkle it on the top. Now I'm patting this down into it, but do be careful because that filling is hot. You do have the option to do the filling ahead of time and let it cool. I'm just going to pat that all together. Now we're going to pop this in the oven, 300 degrees for about 35 minutes, and this will all brown up, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Now by sliding it out onto a cutting board like that, that makes it a little easier to handle because it's moist around the edge. And I do the same thing when I've got, when I'm taking pies out of the oven. I'll either put it onto a cutting board or onto a cookie sheet, just something that I can slide out and I've got some stability in underneath it so I can maneuver it without burning myself or slopping filling anywhere. So now what we have to do is we have to wait, because the critical thing here is going to be making sure that this is cool. And then once it's cool, we'll be able to cut it. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. One is cutting it into pieces that are about 1 inch square, and that's typically what you would do for an afternoon tea, sort of just a little snack. Or you can cut it into bigger squares, like 2 inches by 2 inches, and maybe serve it with a little ice cream as a dessert. So anyway, we'll let this cool probably an hour and a half or so, and then we'll be back to slice it up. All right, so we're back, and this has had a bit of a chance to cool. And now it's time to dig in. Now, one thing that I've seen done to make it a little bit easier, particularly if you're making it in a bigger pan, is to cut it or to line the pan with parchment paper and then lift it out and cut it with a big knife. But I hadn't done that ahead of time. First one is always a little tricky. So there we go, matrimonial cake. So we've got one layer of the oatmeal, we've got the date in the middle, and then we've got another layer on top, depending on how you've packed it together. And this is still a little bit on the warm side, but you know, they can be picked up to be eaten with the fingers, or they can be, as I mentioned earlier, if you cut it in if you want a bigger piece for a full dessert, then that'd be kind of a eat it with a fork kind of moment. And there we have it. Beautiful. So, matrimonial cake, ready for a perfect Sunday tea or something like that. Very sweet, but with a lot of good stuff in it, with the dates and the oatmeal. As healthy as a sweet treat is likely to get. So, hope you enjoyed today's episode of Hilltop Stovetop, where we made matrimonial cake, a truly Canadian classic treat, and that you'll remember to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for the next episode. Bye-bye for now.